So good morning, everybody. We'll just wait a few moments to see if while the numbers are increasing. Okay, they seem to be slowing down now. Okay, so welcome to this breakout session on rules of participation and PID policy. I'm Juan Bicarregui from UKRI STFC, and I'll be chairing this session. We have 6 talks, 2 on the rules of participation and 4 on PIDs. We had a 65-minute session, but we've probably already used a few of those minutes, so we have 60 minutes left. I'm going to ask the speakers to speak for 5 minutes maximum each, and in that way we should be able to get through all the talks and have time for a few questions at the end. If the speaker speaks for less than 5 minutes, we might have a few questions on the individual talks, but I suspect each speaker will probably use their full 5 minutes because 5 minutes is not very much. That's all the introduction I had, so we can move ahead a tiny bit ahead of time, but still please stick to your 5 minutes. So the first speaker is Dusan Vudragovic from Belgrade Institute of Physics and for the NI4OS project. He will talk about rules of participation in the NI4OS Europe project. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Dusan.
Thank you. I hope that you can hear me. So yeah, so I will present rules of participation in the context of the NI4OS Europe. So somehow, although the EOSC is an inclusive environment, I think that some concrete procedural and technical rules of participation are somehow imposed by FAIR principles, but also by architecture of the EOSC core layer, EOSC exchange layer. And within the NI4OS Europe, we try to transform these more participation principles into more technical requirements to be satisfied by resource providers in order to be exposed via the catalog. So this transformation is performed using our onboarding methodology that we have developed, and in this methodology we identify the main aspects of resource description at the moment. So each aspect is organized hierarchically into levels based mainly on EOSC core integration complexity and necessity of particular integration. And in this way, so what was the aim of this? In this way, we were able to identify minimal integration level between EOSC exchange and core layers to be satisfied by resources. And in this presentation, I will briefly, within 5 minutes, explain these aspects and integration levels. So the next slide, you can see the main aspects that we have identified of resource, the description, and this is identified during the landscape analysis we performed from the beginning of during the first year of the NI4OS Europe project. So we aimed here somehow to structure collected information that we have received from resource developers and to identify some criteria for the onboarding. So in this process, we end up with 6 different aspects of resource description. So the first aspect is general resource description, and that accumulates practically. This is EOSC profile specification, and it accumulates basic information, marketing information, classification information, location information, etc. Resource provider information also. In the second aspect is resource technical description. So practically this is resource capacity in terms of CPU cores, GPU cores, storage capacity, number of data sets that are registered within repository and similar. Then to assess research development stage, we introduce technology readiness level, and following the same approach, we have defined EOSC integration level to estimate the level of integration of particular service or particular research with EOSC core layer, or within the NIFOS Europe, we call it pre-production environment. And then to be able to measure the research management development, we have put on the same equal footing various perspective of research management following FIT-SM standards. So all these levels we organize gradually, so from 1 to 9, based mainly on integration complexity and necessity of particular integration. And also I have to say that beside these 5 more technical aspects during the onboarding process, the scientific impact of particular research is equally considered and assessed. So on the next slide, you can see just example how the organization of each aspect of research description. So at the moment, the minimal requirements for the onboarding within the NIFOS Europe includes production of user manual, production of terms of use, privacy policy, and access policy, then integration with the help desk system with configuration management database that will enable integration with our monitoring system. And in terms of levels, so practically all these criteria are put in this matrix, and based on in terms of levels, we can say that onboarding onboarding resources with technology level readiness of 9. So these resources have been already used in the production mode, with the EOSC integration level 4 and with the management integration level 3. So
1 minute to go.
Okay, so let's speed up. So let's go to the next slide. So beside this categorization, beside this categorization, we have produced also cumulative level of integration. So practically here we lay out previously introduced levels of integration, and here we can recognize what is the low and minimal level of integration to be satisfied by research providers, what is medium level, high level, but also we can recognize ideally integrated EOSC workflow. So in this way,
you have much more. There's 5 minutes already.
Just to conclude, so in this way, we try somehow to support integration between EOSC Exchange and EOSC core layers, and our aim is to enable assessing the quality of research provided via EOSC portal, via EOSC marketplace. We believe that without such metric, the quality of the onboarding resources cannot be compared from the end user perspective. Practically all resources, without such criteria, all resources onboarded to the marketplace are equal.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dusan. Apologies for having to rush you, but
that's okay.
5 minutes is not very long. Okay, so the next talk is Marianna Katrakazi from ATHENA and also from the NIFOS project, who will talk about RoLECT self-sustainable. Yes, go ahead, Marianna.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will present you this new tool created by ATHENA Research Center, a self-assessment tool that focuses on legal and ethics aspects of EOSC rules of participation. Next slide, please. So RoLECT is a self-assessment tool, not a legal advice. It is designed to promote compliance and identify non-compliance with EOSC rules of participation. Prospective resource providers can verify by themselves if the resources meet the legal and ethics standards of EOSC rules of participation. And this tool is addressed to any resource providers that are familiar with legal and ethics notions of EOSC rules of participation, but they are deprived of a legal expertise. This is the first version released in May, and we hope that it will be endorsed by EOSC governance. Next slide, please. So how it has been developed, this tool, as it has been mentioned during the previous session, the guidelines of EOSC rules of participation are very high level and generic. So this tool is based on those guidelines. We have undertaken a lot of legal work in order to break down those guidelines into general categories. And then we have reconstructed them into units of rules classified according to the priorities of EOSC rules of participation. As a result of this process, we have created a structured flow of questions categorized into 3 levels of importance: low, medium, and high. Next slide, please. So how it works, this tool. Firstly, the user inserts some general information about the resource. For example, the URL where the resource is found, the type of the resource, is it a service or other, and the terms of use. Then, if the resource contains intellectual property rights, the user has to select the types of intellectual property rights, such as trademarks, copyright, or patents, and the licensing conditions that apply to those resources. Another factor that is examined is the existence of any public sector information that the resource may have, cultural information, trade secrets, confidential information, personal data, or ethics. And finally, the user can have an overview of the assessment and issue the assessment report. It is noted that the tool has a dynamic content, so the questions that appear depend on the answers given to the previous sessions. This tool can be explored either as a guest user or as an authenticated user, and you can have a more detailed look by clicking this link. Next slide, please. So let's have a detailed look on the legal and ethics aspects of the tool. As already mentioned, if the resource contains IP, it has to be verified that no intellectual property rights of third parties are infringed. The licensing conditions also that relates to such IP right are examined. For example, if such intellectual property right is governed by an open license, a standard license, or by a machine-readable license. Then, if the resource contains 2 or more different open licenses at the same time, a compatibility assessment has to be made. And at this stage, it is worth mentioning that we have created another tool, LCT, License Clearance Tool, that has been designed exactly for this object to face those legal challenges related to the compatibility assessment of open licenses. Then, if the resource has a copyright, the user has to indicate whether such copyright is in the public domain and thus it can be used. Other than this, if the resource, for example, contains an image of a monument that falls into the scope of cultural heritage law, this has to be indicated as well because it restricts the use of the resource. In addition, if the resource has personal data, there are 3 questions that aim to reassure a minimum level of compliance with GDPR related to the lawfulness of the processing, information obligation, and data subjects' rights. Next slide, please. Yes.
1 minute to go.
Yes. Another factor that is examined is the existence of any ethics restrictions. For example, if the resource adheres to a code of conduct or to any commonly agreed principles. And finally, any other condition that may allow, for example, if the resource is a public sector information according to the Open Data Directive, or if there is any other condition that restricts the use of the resource, for example, if there are any trade secrets or confidential information, this it has been indicated too. Last slide, please. So I would like to sum up and point out that, as you can see, there are many legal challenges that arise from different legal fields with respect to the rules of participation. So our aim was to simplify and standardize to the extent feasible the legal and ethics requirements for onboarding to the EOSC ecosystem, with view to help resource providers and contribute to the implementation of EOSC. Thank you very much. And I remain available for any questions.
Thank you very much, Marianna. And we will move straight on. Those were the 2 talks on rules of participation. The next 4 talks are on PID policy. And the first speaker is Mark van der Sanden. Go ahead, Mark.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Mark van der Sanden. I'm from STFC and also the technical coordinator within EUDAT. And in this talk, I talk about the EOSC PID policy. 5 minutes is not too long, so I will focus only where it influences the EUDAT services. Next slide. EUDAT, I think most of you already have heard EUDAT, but if you want to focus on the EUDAT version, data is shared and preserved across borders and disciplines. Next. I think that is also very much to what the EOSC is about. Next, please. Next slide. In this slide, you have an overview of the EOSC service portfolio. I will not go in all details, but I will just highlight which services are being influenced by the EOSC PID policy. Next, please. The first one is our PID service is B2Handle. Next. Then we have B2Safe, which is a platform for implementing data management policies. And one of those is registering automatically persistent identifiers. Next, please. B2Share is our data publication platform where we register PIDs for landing pages, for data sets, but also for the individual objects. Next, please. And B2Find is our data discovery service, and here we collect a lot of metadata, and within the metadata, persistent identifiers are contained. Next, please. This is the PID policy, and if you look at the bullets, these are the principles as described within the EOSC PID policy. And I think one of the main challenges is I think that they are described as principles. EUDAT is certainly fully supporting the EOSC PID policy itself. But the question is, what does this mean then in practice? How do you translate the principles to a practical level so that we can see, okay, how can we comply to those principles? And I think a similar comment has been made this morning also already by Owen for the rules of participation. Principles are good, but for us as a provider, we need to know what does it mean in practice. Next, please. If you look at the generic definitions, PIDs should be globally unique. And I think the PIDs which we assign are globally unique. We make use of the handle system. Therefore, the prefixes which we use are globally unique. And we also recommend that for the suffix, you use the UUID, which is a random string, to make also the suffix globally unique. So therefore, the PIDs are globally unique. Persistent, our PIDs are persistent, but by talking to many of the different communities, persistency means for many communities differently. And I think that is also challenging. What would that mean for persistency for us as providers, but also, for example, how do you offer this to the communities? Resolvable, the PIDs which we generate, we make use of the handle system, and therefore they are globally resolvable. But what does mean globally resolvable? Because if you have a website and you have an API, which is a public website, does this mean that you are globally resolvable? So also there are some better guidelines for what does it mean in practice. Next, please. Maybe you can click through all the animations because this is not really working. A little bit more. Thanks. In the PID policy, there are different roles assigned. And if you can, as you can see, within many of the roles, it will influence EUDAT, and we need to take action to implement for the different roles what it does mean in practice. We are not the PID authority, as already said. We assign prefixes from EPIC, which falls within the EPIC domain, but also in the donor namespace domain. But if you look at, we are a PID service provider. EUDAT is a PID service provider, but is relying on partners who actually run and operate the service. And my own organization is one of those service providers. The PID service which we provide is Beta Handle. If you look at the PID manager, those are mostly the services who does the registration and minting of the PIDs. For this, we have B2Share and B2Save. For the PID owner, that is the organizations who owns the PIDs, but also are allowed to mint PIDs and update PIDs. EUDAT is this for the services which are provided centrally for EUDAT, but also the EUDAT members are, of course, also PID owners because they run the services for which, within which the PIDs are being minted. And as an end user, Be-Defined can be seen as an end user. There's a service because we consume PIDs and make this available, but of course also the users of EUDAT services are end users. Next, please.
Just 30 seconds to go, Mark, please.
Yeah, this is the final slide with some challenges. What's said is, I think we have to come from principles to concrete criteria so that we can assess what does it mean, can we comply to the PID policy, but we need to do this for the different roles. I see also technical interoperability, and that was also already highlighted in the PID architecture document. And I think for this, we can distinguish between what does it mean for resolving to be technically interoperable, and so also for minting, and separate on this, provide different guidelines on what does it mean to implement PID kernel information, but also maybe for different profiles. The same is on tombstones. If a data object is not discoverable anymore, it's not available, how do you register this within a PID record? Long-term sustainability, I think, is in general a challenge, because what is long-term? Is that indefinitely? Is that a very long-term? And also we have to be able to do this on justifiable cost. And I think because PIDs is very global, so we can do a lot within Europe, within EOSC, but we also have to relate, okay, what does this mean on the global level?
Okay,
next, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll move straight on to Jonathan Clark from the DOI Foundation with an interesting title. What does the P in PID mean? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'll see if I can put my video on as well. There we go. Thank you very much for this. I'm going to be I'll try and get us back on track. I'm going to be very quick. Then move to the next slide. So I think persistence is often taken for granted. It's just assumed. We call a PID, and the P stands for persistence, therefore it is. But this is really wrong. And I think this is a plea really to all of us to really take a look at persistence and dig into it. It's not an inherent property of the system. In fact, I would say, and I know completely that, that no one will take this over, but the P really should stand for persistable, which is something that can be made to persist or to be permanent. Can is here the operable word, and it needs to be done design and through continuing effort. And I think those are two elements that are really important. If you can go to the next slide, please. So in the DOI Foundation, we found this is Andrew Trelaw's 5 persistences, which you can find online, or I can send you a link. It's everywhere. Just do Andrew Trelaw 5 persistences and you'll find it. We find it particularly helpful to analyze what we do, how persistent are we. Next slide, please. But the two, oh, that hasn't quite worked. Well, it's supposed to bind the last two. The two, persistence of the object, the identifier, and the binding are known problems. We have solutions. Everybody does. The one that exercises us the most of these last two, the persistence of the service, in this case, the service that the DOI Foundation offers. Go to the next slide, please. Oh, that's back. One more. That's it, yes. So in essence, this comes down to two things, disaster recovery and business continuity. And of the two, disaster recovery is the easiest to deal with. We can think of archives, that perhaps the provider does themselves, archiving, but also archival services. backups and recovery plans. That is something I think also that when it comes to rules of engagement, that's easily auditable. There are standards for disaster recovery, and that should be doable. The second one is much harder to achieve, business continuity. And it's part of the fact that, and you'll see this in a number of places, that any PID system is a combination of a technical infrastructure and a social infrastructure. And we can do a lot on the technical infrastructure. We can escrow the code, we can put it on GitHub, we can make it available. But the social infrastructure is essentially know-how, people's knowledge about how a system works. And that's an awful lot harder to sustain over the long term. It means you need, it's not just a question of good documentation. There's a lot of know-how that's very difficult to document. And we spend a lot of time thinking about this. Our approach so far, our best answer to this is to avoid it at all costs. So make sure the business is sustainable. We keep, for instance, a year of operational in reserves in order to make sure that if anything really disastrous happens, we can run a whole year, our proxy and the resolution services. But these things are important, and we have multiple fallbacks. So not just one fallback, but many. That's our best answer. I don't think it's enough, actually, to be honest. I think we can do more here, and that's a live topic for the foundation. But anyway, this is my contribution. Thank you very much. I just wanted to stimulate discussion around this persistable concept that, yes, it's persistent, but what are we doing to actually make it so? And I think that might be helpful, I hope. Thank you. And it's less than 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And indeed, we have gained 30 seconds back. So we'll move straight on. The next talk is Andrey Vukolov from ELETTRA Sincrotrone and the EXPANDS project. We'll talk about openly reproducible PIDs as a factor of fairness in data sharing practices. Go ahead, Andrey.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Andrey Vukolov. I am from ELETTRA Sincrotrone Trieste working alongside EXPANDS project. Next slide, please. And I should, in this presentation, to highlight the problem that we discovered several weeks ago. That's closely connected with a previous presentation. That the access model via PIDs to the data objects stored in the cloud in everywhere is not defined explicitly, and the data and metadata dedicated to the single data object placed into the cloud are existence agnostic against each other. Because, for example, the stored metadata don't know if there is a digital object closely connected exists within the cloud. Next slide, please. So here's the current mode. Here is the current model of PID consumer and registrar relationship. So we have authorities that registers PID for every kind of data and metadata. Next slide, please, not to spend the time. So in the context of findability, we have the current model that provides one and the only access endpoint. So if this access endpoint become unavailable for us, the PID is unresolvable. And also it is closely connected with a reverse lookup possibility inside the cloud. So if we have a given persistent identifier, from the client side, it is practically impossible to reproduce it and to verify that this persistent identifier was issued by the given authority or registrar without placing a request to this and only this registrar. So, and also the request model is explicitly dependent from the implementation. So it always affects findability and provides the current model sometimes unavailable. Next slide, please. Next, for the accessibility, we have the only opportunity for the registrars and authorities to declare themselves as trusted sources. They have no any other opportunity to prove that they are trusted from the society. So now we have concurrent resolving tasks from the sides of a client, of a PID customer, and any other person within the workflow. And also with every member of such a workflow is a single point of failure. So that's always affects accessibility, as I already said. Please, next slide. In the context of usability, we have only the non-redundant PIDs that that prevents the client to reuse the current PID to prove that he downloaded the given data and accessed them. Yes, Jonathan, thanks. We have this functionality for many years with multiple resolution. But I'm talking now about, at first, reproducibility of the given PID on the client side. So to peer-to-peer provenance, for peer-to-peer provenance at first. This is what I'm talking about. Yes, so please, next slide. And about the definition of reproducible PID, because it was already mentioned in our PID architecture as a possible internal identification mechanism. It could be defined like DOI and signed by the public key. But the mostly essential thing we should have to implement the reproducible PIDs is a distributed database in which every involved research infrastructure store the locally updated and locally reproducible copy of available prefix and metadata. This is what I'm talking about. And having this database, we have redundancy on the client side. So next slide, please. And if this PID is reproducible from the given metadata, or it is reproducible on the client side, at every moment we have an opportunity to prove that the data is published by the given research infrastructure.
Andrey, could you finish soon, please?
Yes. So I know about the timing, and so next slide, please. Sorry, but the presentation was mangled. So the workflow defined by truly reproducible persistent identifiers is represented here. But without any remarks I placed. So it was something went wrong. So next slide, please. For affecting fairness, the prefix-based and reproducible persistent identifiers at first should act like parent points for the whole metadata infrastructure, because to obtain the redundant copy of a given metadata from any infrastructure involved from in the European Open Science Cloud. So this is the main target I set for this presentation.
Okay.
So, yeah, please, for this, for not to waste the time, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Because something definitely went wrong with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Andrey, very much for that. Next, and the last talk is a double act between Ed Pentz and Matt Buys from Crossref and DataCite, respectively. And we have Beyond PIDs Global Openly Scholarly Infrastructure. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Yes, 2 speakers, 5 minutes. Let's get going. So we're going to be talking today about open scholarly infrastructure. And one of the key messages we have is that we need to move beyond talking about PIDs and persistent identifiers. They're very important, but I think often the PID is too much of the focus rather than the services and infrastructure that it connects with. And EOSC is going to be connecting with many different types of systems and different infrastructure, some of which is global in nature. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today, and some principles that we've been working on in our community and how that's relevant to EOSC. So we think that there's this class of organizations, some of whom are listed here, that are sort of foundational infrastructure, and Crossref, DataCite, ORCID, and ROAR are examples of these. They're global, nonprofit, community-led organizations. They're going to be used within EOSC. We're involved in various discussions, but often these systems are talked about with the persistent identifier itself being the center of attention, and that really misrepresents what's going on there. And we really want to encourage more focus on the infrastructure. Of course, EOSC is looking at that, but when looking at things that are maybe external to EOSC, there has to be a focus on open, sustainable, forkable, and community-governed initiatives. We want to avoid the situation where the persistent identifiers themselves are seen as ends in themselves and almost imbued with magical properties. And this is kind of picking up what Jonathan was saying, that there's a lot more that goes behind any PID. And so we really think there needs to be a focus on that, and it's about the metadata and the relationships expressed in the metadata. And so we think something that can feed into this is the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. So I'll just hand over to Matt to continue.
Great, thanks. If you can advance the slides to a couple, Ed talk through these points and we will share the slides. If you can just go through to the fifth slide, or the sixth slide rather, where it says why the goals of, yeah, there we go, thanks. Really, why does POSI exist, and why were the principles established? And really this is around a vision of a rich and reusable open network of relationships, connecting research organizations, people, things, and actions, a scholarly record that the global community can build on forever. And this is the persistence piece, and for the benefit of society. And so the first steps in fulfilling this vision we feel are really important is that we need to bring together these principles and work around these as open scholarly infrastructure to take us beyond the narrow world of persistent identifiers in its own, and really support open research and researchers, establishing trust and accountability in the research infrastructure. Next slide, please. The principles are really established in three areas: governance, sustainability, and insurance. And you can see from this that it's not just particularly about the type of PID or the type of technology. It's important how the infrastructure is governed, developed, sustained. Open data and open source are important, but so are community governance, transparency, and financial sustainability. Underpinning these principles is the idea of trustworthiness, demonstrating why the community should trust an organization or service. And the principles were developed on from practical experience with Crossref and ORCID and other initiatives. Some of these principles are aspirational and might be difficult for an organization to meet, but they're important that an organization can commit towards these and commit over time towards these principles. Next slide, please. Here are some examples. Thanks, Ryan. Crossref released a blog post talking about their alignment and commitment to the principles. Next slide, please. As did Dryad. Next slide, please. As did ROAR. And finally, in closing, the final slide, please. Really looking at how this comes into EOSC is that any initiative within EOSC could self-identify as open infrastructure. We feel that the PID policy implementation activities should really consider alignment with the principles. It provides a very clear, simple checklist of 16 principles that organizations can commit to and are designed to balance each other, and provides a reference point for the community. We are encouraging self-assessments from others in the community, and we'll post the link to the website in a moment, and you can make a pull request if you have done an assessment. We have seen more and more organizations doing it. DataCite ourselves are doing this, and also the ability to assess partners and service providers against the principles, hold them and us against or to account for these principles for the benefit of open research and researchers. And with that, I'll thank you for your time. Okay, thank you very much, Ed and Matt. So now, apologies for having to rush the speakers through all that, but now we get the good side of having rushed, which is that we have some time for discussion. So at this point, I think we can open the floor to anybody. You should be able to just switch on your mic and speak. Obviously, we've had some questions in the chat. Some have been answered, some are left as questions. Maybe we ought to structure the discussion into two parts. First part on the rules of participation talks and the second part on PIDs. We have about 20 minutes. There was less on rules, so maybe less than 10 minutes on the rules and a bit more than 10 minutes on the PIDs. So please, anybody who either asked a question in the chat or just who has a question about the rules of participation point, please go ahead.
If everyone's going to be quiet, I can say something. Just to say, I like the presentations, and I would encourage not only participation in the rules of participation group, the task force, which you can apply for, but there is going to have to be some way that the metadata schema for describing providers and services is governed. There is one in place from EOSC Enhance and EOSC Future called the EOSC Profiles, but I think we'll need other people to contribute to this, and that will closely tie to what Dusan was presenting in terms of the work from NIFOS, which was more for me on the side of the kind of onboarding and templates rather than the kind of rules that those templates implement somehow. It was more on the implementation side. So I think that's work I would encourage lots of people to buy into. And then just one point that I raised about the RoLECT, although it's a difficult one, self-certification is easy. At some stage, we're going to have to get past it in some areas to some means of verification for some things. And I think this is a challenge we're all going to have. How much can we trust people, particularly on things like GDPR? We're not lawyers. We can't necessarily assess privacy policies, but we know it's a requirement to have them, not just from us, but from Europe. So we're going to have to, as a community, look into what enhanced means of verification over self-certification are available, or at least how can we check whether self-certification appears to be correct or not. Thanks.
Thanks, Owen. Any other comments?
Yes, hello. I agree with Owen. It's very difficult to put verification processes, and it is a major challenge. This is what I answered to the chat room. RoLECT does not have in place so far verification processes, but it is in our aims to introduce such processes in the future. And I would like also to answer to the answer of Mr. Andreas Narshorst regarding the explanation of what is resource. As I mentioned during the presentation, this tool is addressed to users that are familiar with the rules of participation. So the definition of resource is something that we consider that is known within the community that is interested in EOSC and generally in this ecosystem. So that's why we do not have an explanation, and we have only we have a question where the user can select the type of the resource, service or other. But of course, it is a very good remark in order to take it into consideration for the next versions of the tool. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? I noticed a question towards the beginning, I think it was from Andrey, about machine readability of licenses, but I think there's a more general point behind that, which is as we move from principles to practice, as both halves of the session were doing, to what degree do we believe we can get to machine readable rules and machine automatable enforcement of those rules? Maybe Owen.
Yeah, sorry, well, stuck with me. I think we can make rules more machine readable and more machine actionable, but there will always be a percentage which requires human judgment or interpretation. And I think our goal is to make everything automatable that can be automatable, so that the limited human resources we have can concentrate on the intangible, the judgment-based, the part which we know, yeah, we can't let a machine necessarily decide, or at least a human has to check. And I think this is why we need rules of participation to be an ongoing activity rather than one that just runs for 24 months and stops. There will have to be something that continues. So I'm totally in favor of automation, and we're going this way in the EOSC future and machine readability, but there will always be some bits that aren't, basically.
Thanks. I have two hands. First, Mark.
Yeah, I think there will be a big challenge on this because humans can interpret and machines need to be very clear in what you need to be interpreting and how you can interpret this. So if you want to have machine readability, then you have to have clear definitions of what to assess and how to assess. And I think we are not yet at this stage, and it will probably take some time. But I think we have to go into this direction to improve this.
Thanks, Mark. Ed?
Yeah, and just to agree, I think on the point about machine readability and machine actionability are two different things. Mm-hmm. And there's been some work on this with in the research object space with NISO, and it can be very tricky to define some of this stuff. But if you look at an example of, for instance, Creative Commons or some of the open source licenses, you can have something that's very simple, even just a URI, for instance, for a Creative Commons license, and it could be machine actionable, even though the license itself isn't machine readable. So, you can sort of come at it from both ways.
Thanks, Ed. Any other comments or questions on the rules of participation? We can move on to the PID policy part of the session now. Who would like to make a comment on what we've heard about PID policy?
I've put a few comments in the chat. So there are several issues I would like to pinpoint. Actually, there is the issue of data curation. And we've heard about open data and the way data is handled, which is, let's say, controlled or in a way monitored by the community itself. And we know that these can create issues for data curation. Another idea or I wanted to share with you that the sheer number of resources, researchers, organizations, etc., which will cooperate, contribute in EOSC will be a challenge as far as human curation is concerned. So I would like to hear about that, I mean, from the speakers.
Any response to that? Mark, your hand is still up, but I don't know if that's from before or from now.
Yeah, it's not from before, but it was not directly on this question.
Well, let's see if anyone wants to respond to the question first, and we'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'll have a stab on the data curation side. If you remember on those 5 persistences that I showed, one of them was the persistency of the object that the PID is pointing to. And that, of course, goes to who's responsible for keeping that object live and accessible, and what happens, and it does happen all the time that those things do disappear. There are a couple of possibilities on that we've been talking about. One is, and I think Mark, you put Tombstone on, or somebody put Tombstone on one of the slides. So one possibility is to at least capture all the metadata that you know about an object before it disappeared and put it on as a tombstone to say, well, look, it was last known position was here. This is all the information we have. At least that's less bad than having just a dead 404 saying, sorry, not found. The second thing is whether there's a way to engage people like the Internet Archive or some open archive system so that at least you could do a try. Given the metadata, you could have the system give a try to see if it can find it somewhere else. And thirdly, of course, pushing on that one, you could start to adopt policies that if people are including their data, that they have to make statements about the longevity of that data. And so you might have data providers saying this piece of data is in the metadata, we guarantee it will be available 5, 10, 20, 30, whatever years. And what happens after that? Perhaps a deposit at an archive. But it's a really good point. I don't know if that answers your question, Gael, but that's sort of our thinking on it.
Well, I guess everyone is faced with the same challenge regarding data curation and also the preservation of the content itself, or at least the preservation of one instance of the content.
Yeah, just to further comment this, because my comment was also on the multiple interpretations of the P of persistent. And I think there's not only a technical challenge, but it is also more policy challenge. And that is also, again, I think, in the curation. There are different angles on this, who is responsible. And I think from a provider point of view, you can describe what your policies are on data curation. But at the end also, the owners of the data should take up responsibility. And I think there, between the owners and the providers, you need those kind of agreements, to which level, to which extent this will happen, or what is required. And that can differ. Certainly, if you look at the P in persistent, we have many discussions in EUDAT with many different communities, and there you already see that the persistency is completely different, what they mean. But it should be clear, I think, more in advance to see, okay, what does it mean? And have agreements on this, instead of afterwards you discover what it means. I think the step before is the important step.
I just add, my point was really not just what it means, but what they do. So I think what's important is what people do to, in whatever community it is, whatever they call and mean by persistence, what do they actually do to make sure it is? That's sort of the key message that I had. Sorry, just another plug.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, a dog that's persistently barking doesn't mean they're barking every second of every day. It means that they bark at appropriate times, that they're trying hard to bark at all times. Yeah. Okay, any other comments? Please go ahead. It's very difficult to follow everything that's happening in the chat. So if anybody who has put a comment in the chat wants to speak up and make it, please go ahead.
Just to follow up on the data curation one, what would be possible is to have a system, technically easy, but difficult perhaps to arrange. But if a resource was unavailable and I mentioned multiple resolution in the chat, but if a resource was unavailable, it goes to a second try, and the second try could be an archive. So I don't know what the digital preservation policy is around EOSC, but if there was to be something, you could easily set up your PIDs to point as a service, if unavailable, go here, and then require the data providers to deposit copies after a period of time. That's all technically doable, but I think it's the social infrastructure that's important, whether that's acceptable to people or what the copyright implications are, I don't know.
Well, in that case, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I had Gail first, I think.
No, that's interesting, but does it mean that there should be a central archive or something, within EOSC to where repositories that do not have any long-term preservation policy or facility could actually deposit their content, and that could be an option, for example.
I think the question is to which extent does EOSC want to take up this responsibility, but also including the funds to be able to sustain this. At the moment, that is not yet clear, but certainly the responsibility of maintaining and keeping the data safe for long term, and how they want to implement this can in different ways. But that is initially by the service providers and agreements of the data owners, which deposit the data at the service provider side. The question how far EOSC is willing to pick up on this, I think that is a good question, but also that is not for free. So it will cost, and it will have an increasing cost because over time you accumulate a lot of data, and the question is, okay, do you want to keep all the data? Do you keep the data for eternity, or maybe is there a review process of which data to keep or not keep? So there are some, I think, complexities on this.
And we can't rely on Moore's law to save us, as we have been for many years now.
I agree.
Yes, I mean, realistically, nobody really imagines that the data will be there for all eternity, right? But so the time frame that we are imagining that we preserve and persist for is clearly vital.
I think if you look at this, many national regulations is that the data should be maintained for at least 10 years if it is supporting research. But I always take the example that if we remove all the data after 10 years, then we do not have any historical legacy. And probably if we had demolished the pyramids after 10 years, their function, then we do not have the pyramids at this moment, which we can look at. So I think it is a little bit of more discussion on what do you want to maintain. Does not mean that you should maintain everything for eternity, but the question is, what do you want to maintain and to which extent?
Yeah,
that depends very much on the nature of the data. Sorry, Jonathan, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was going to say there's actually a good one. My colleague Paul Jessup has this story, and I like it. He said that when the great library of Alexandria, which actually fell into disrepute because the Romans failed to fund it properly, and it disappeared, if we just had the card catalogue, we would be much richer as a society. And I think that's also the point. It might be that we have to accept that not all data will survive, but boy, the metadata should, in my opinion, because that's the modern card catalogue, right? And if we just had that, we could, and you can see it today, there's quite a bit of research can be done just on the metadata without having to go into the data and still be useful and valuable. So I would make a plug for the long-term persistence, and I would say 100 years at least plus of metadata.
Thanks. So your hand is up, Andrea.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that we talk about data as if that is one thing and it's all kind of equal. And I think there is an ignorance in this discourse that data have different functions in the research process. So there are data you wanted to preserve for a semi or for a midterm just to make sure that reproducibility is ensured for certain research, but they will be replaced as we are also not conserving the experimental settings in the natural sciences for centuries, except of those for very, very important experiments, right? And then they go to science musea. So there are data which are probably means to reach an output, and the output should be still properly documented in an article or in a paper, and can be discarded. And then you have data which do have another kind of quality. So the pyramids in Egypt, which also served as a metaphors, these are not all houses built in this country in this period of time. Those were specific kind of buildings, right? We all know that. And I think unless we kind of make these difference, it's very hard to also develop good strategies.
Okay, thank you. We are out of time. So thank you all very much for that interesting discussion, and a special thanks to the speakers for having to give us a lot of information in a very short time. I hope you enjoyed the session, and we can meet again in the main room now.